So why are some people so rich and others so poor? So there are three types of explanations for these gaps that I've been talking about. The one which is most common among economists is that some people are more productive than others. So essentially it's all due to skill differences. And if you run wage regressions, which we do, you find that education and skill is a huge explanatory factor in that. So there's definitely a skill element to that. But it's not the only story. So these wage regressions tell typically only about explain half of the variation that we see. The second story is that some people get rich off the surplus produced by others. So some of that is just straightforward theft. A more polite word that the economists use is called extraction of monopoly rents, which essentially is when you are running a business and you have no competitors, you can essentially charge whatever price you want to. And off those monopoly rents, you can make a pretty good living. Of course, those monopoly rents are contested. So we typically find that in those sectors of the South African industry, and Johan Fedeker did the numbers on that, some of them are extremely concentrated and show extremely high markups. That in those industries, unions also happen to be particularly strong, so you have to share some of those spoils. You have a fight between shareholders, managers, and workers over who gets to keep most of those. But that will introduce inequality between people who are sitting in some of these sectors and people who don't. The third story is that some people gamble and get lucky. So that is not just lotto. Essentially, a lot of economists think of the stock market as a little bit like a gamble, and you have winners and losers, and you can strike it very rich or you can get wiped out. Now, in fact, that whole story is essentially explaining what happens in the financial sector. The way economists tend to think of those gambles is that essentially that's kind of fair enough. And if there are people gambling, all it does is it creates essentially enough turnover in the market that people who don't want to gamble can come in and get a fair price for whatever they're wanting to buy. But we've seen most recently in that LIBOR scandal, and certainly the financial collapse that we've seen recently, is that it doesn't look as though those gambles are entirely fair. And certainly the kind of people who make those gambles got something spectacularly wrong. Otherwise we wouldn't have seen the meltdown. And the reason for that is that the typical models through which we think about how likely or unlikely certain events are, whether you're going to make a profit or a loss, economists typically have used something called the normal distribution, which works extremely well for any outcome which is shaped by lots of little influences. And the best example of that is height. So if I look at height among South African males, essentially that distribution from the Demographic and Health Survey looks like that. I have superimposed the normal distribution, which is the bell-shaped curve on top of that, and you see it actually fits it beautifully. So the normal distribution works extremely well for explaining something like height, where we think that the outcome, how tall somebody is a result of a whole lot of different factors, but most of those having a small influence up or down. So basically, nutrition shocks that you get at various stages of your life, health shocks, a little bit like what goes wrong with your hormones, they all contribute to height, and in the end, the overall distribution kind of washes into that neat shape. Now, financial earnings don't look anything like that. And in fact, there's a theory which says that basically the kind of distribution that we've got there is not influenced by thousands of little events, but it's actually likely to be influenced by one or two big events. So big meltdowns, big windfalls are much more important in explaining what happens in the financial markets than it would do for height. And there's an argument out there that, in fact, what we need are distributions which have a much fatter tail, one where basically, essentially, that don't die out so quickly as these guys do, but essentially which are stretched so that you can get extreme outcomes much more frequently. And it turns out that empirically that type of distribution, the Pareto distribution, fits the top end of the South African wage distribution fairly well. I'll explain a little bit how this works. I'm starting off with the Penn's parade, which we've already seen. I'm going to take this diagram, I'm just going to flip it on its side. So it's the same diagram, but now essentially the income is essentially along the bottom, and the proportion of the population in reverse order is on the y-axis. So I'm just going to look at the top tail, so I'm going to chop it off. And then instead of graphing this line here, I'm going to graph it on a log-log scale, for those of you who know your maths. If you get a straight line, then you've got this Pareto distribution, and you've got something that isn't normal. Now, when I do this for South Africa's wage distribution, well, that looks pretty much like a straight line to me. There are a couple of sort of anomalies, OHS 95, 99. These are the anomalies where we're still working on trying to work out what happened in those years. But pretty much all of the others look pretty much like straight lines. So I think there's fairly good evidence that our earnings distribution at the top essentially has much more inequality in it, is much further stretched than you would believe if you believed in this idea that the outcomes is just due to all these little small events leading to the final outcome of your income. Now, one explanation for why a Pareto distribution may work there is essentially if you have part of what you're earning is essentially linked to your position in the hierarchy, where the further up in the hierarchy, the more people you control, the higher your wage should be. So, my summary in the South African income distribution is that there are at least these four elements that go into explaining why we have inequality. So there are definitely productivity differences. There is definitely some ability to extract rents. There are probably supervisory premiums. And then for some people, essentially, there's luck. If you get the promotion, you go up. If you don't, you don't. So the idea that basically the inequalities that we're seeing are purely a reflection of people's abilities or of operation of market forces, kind of in a sort of competitive sense, I think just doesn't work for the South African income distribution. What is worse is that these different elements are likely to interact. And some of my colleagues, Mikkel Pellicer and Vimal Ranchod, have argued that we're likely to have inequality traps in South Africa. And I'm just going to talk you through a little bit what an inequality trap might look like. So basically the idea is that if we have some people who are highly skilled and a lot of people who are not so skilled, the highly skilled people end up getting a huge premium. They get a very good wage. But one of the things, of course, that happens is that teaching, which requires skilled labor, then becomes expensive too. So basically the poor people then find it very hard to get the education that would give them the skill to kind of break into that top end of the market. And of course the skilled people, if they know anything at all, they also know how to extract rents, and they're going to be sitting on top of those supervisory hierarchies. So essentially these three mechanisms are likely to reinforce each other in a way that is actually going to make that inequality very intractable. There's an additional ingredient. A really influential book that came out this year by Asimoglu and Robinson argues that what makes certain nations poor and others rich is their institutions. So basically, if you have a set of rules that are inclusive, that allow people to use their initiative, their skill, and their drive, then in the long run you do much better than places that have extractive institutions, which are essentially institutions where you kind of steal of others. And apartheid, without a doubt, had a lot of those extractive institutions. And the real problem, when you look at this thing historically, is that in a lot of places that have had changes, the new elite that comes in frequently gets tempted, instead of abolishing those extractive institutions, to simply plug in there and essentially turn the taps their way. So it's much easier to bully the corporations that are making huge monopoly profits, to kind of get some of your mates onto their boards, or to even kind of crook some people out of their mining rights, than it is to open up opportunities on a much more broad basis.